Starting with the shutter in the cocked position, I'll put the retard gear train in place. Pull back this lever so that it's not trapped on top of the blade actuating ring, that it sits behind the little tab on the blade actuating ring. Get the fixing screw in at this end. This is the pivot point because there's an adjustment on this speed train. And the screw at this end goes through an oversized hole in the speed train, which allows you some adjustment. So you can swing the speed train inwards for greater engagement with the cam to slow the shutter down, or outwards for lesser engagement of the cam. Lesser engagement with the cam to speed the shutter up. Got quite a good spring in here, so I'm just put that in for greater engagement. We'll fire the shutter, see how that behaves. Pull that back. Well, that was a pretty quick second, so it's certainly going to need more engagement than that. I'll swing that speed train in slightly more, slacken that screw off, bring the speed train in slightly. That's getting somewhere approaching it. That sounds good. The self-timer. This tab on the self-timer has to fit over the pin that runs on this arm. So I have to get that hooked into position. Drop my speed train in, and the speed train, I'll see I've got that set, so I'll run that down a bit. It's holding back that lever which will run the speed train down. And I should get this seated into the case. That's seated nicely. I felt that click into place. There's a screw on the base of this that falls into a little hole in the mechanism plate. So it seats quite positively. One screw holds it in position, and that's our speed train in place. That runs down nice and smoothly. That all looks very good. We're getting near the end of this shutter for closing it up. So I just need to clean up these four components, and there's nothing else to go in there. So I'll just give these a wipe with some Naphtha. We'll get the internal rack in place. I've got to get it over that spring there, over that post. And the spring has got a bit of a twist, and it's about 90 degrees out from where I'd like it to be. Let's get this positioned on here. So that's sitting in the case. It's pulled back against the lever on the self-timer. That's sitting in the rest position. That's sitting against the stop there. That looks good. Here's the pinion. Now the pinion, I've given the shaft of that a wipe with some molybdenum paste. And this should be coupled to here such that the last tooth on the pinion here comes round past the last tooth on there. I'll just zoom you in a bit, you can have a look at that. You can see the arrangement there. That should be correct. Now this latch needs to go in place. This is the latch that holds the shutter in the cocked position. That wriggles into place. It's usually not too much of a fight. The speed settings cam plate, I usually give a wipe through the centre of that with molybdenum paste, and on the cam surfaces for the flash sync and the shutter speed setting. And fit this in place. Make sure it's not trapped under that B lever there. Yeah, that looks good. And its retaining ring can be clipped into position. And the shutter at this stage should be good to go. Now you could cock the shutter by pulling this around carefully so you don't dig your screwdriver into anything. We'll set this to 1 second. We'll see what happens. Well, it certainly runs smoothly enough. I think that's a bit quick. I've got a tool that I've got here made to do the cocking of the shutter, which cocks it as the camera would. What's it like on an 1/8? Much too quick. Okay. So in my case I want greater engagement with the cam in order to slow the shutter speeds down. So I move that back out the way so I've got access to that screw down there. Slacken that off. Move my speed train in, which in this case is going in as far as it will go, and see what we get. Do I get something approaching an 1/8 of a second? That's still quick, so I will need to make another adjustment. And what I will first, I will go and test this 1 second speed. If the 1 second speed is good, oh yeah, I'm just looking at the contact between the pin here and this plate. Now that's going to give us our 1 second. Oh, I can make an adjustment here. I've got a hollow punch here just the right size. If I hook it over the pin on the arm of this self-timer, bend that out slightly, it'll allow the self-timer to drop in further and it should slow down the speeds. That sounded promising. I usually use the 1/8 of a second and the 15th of a second as my indicators for telling me how accurate things are set before I bother to go through and push it on the machine. That sounded promising. Might have been a little bit quick. What's it like on the 15th? Yeah, I'll go and test that. That sounds within half a stop. I'll find out shortly. Right, I have this all clean. On this little spring here I'm putting a blob of molybdenum paste there. I'm using that mostly to glue my ball in place there so that that ball bearing doesn't run away. Now I've picked up a bit of cotton here. Let me see if I can see the back of that. That's better. Now the pinion goes over this post. Now, there's a recess on one side of the pinion, and obviously the recessed side goes over the post. Otherwise it'll sit too high and it won't work. Simple as that. Make sure that thread of cotton is gone. This plate goes on, just pushes over that pin slightly, and you want that centered so it's sitting nice and flush. Put that to one side. Here's the shutter. I'm going to run round these little notches here of the detent for our shutter speed, so I'll just run some molybdenum paste on there. And I'll also run some on the edge of the case here where that thing is pushed up against it. That's fine. I'll make these two pieces together. It only goes on one way. There's a notch here that goes over a pin there. I'll lower that into position. And I'm going to cock this because that'll allow me to ensure that the pinion gear's picked up correctly. And it did. And there are 3 screws that hold this in place. So I will get those 3 screws run lightly into place. Do them up very lightly at this stage. Don't do them up tight or you may live to regret it. Two of them will probably suffice. Now flip this over, and I've got to make sure that this black shim is seated firmly around the outside of the lens tube, not sitting in front of it. That looks good. Let's get our 3 screws in here. One, there's one here. I'll just move this lever, so I'll hold in that release, move this lever across just so I've got better access to that screw hole. And those 3 screws I want done up quite tight. If I set my shutter speed, I'll check that the detents move smoothly. They do. That would be B in that position. Let's cock it and fire it. Make sure that the B works well. It does. We'll set it at half, quarter, 8. That should be an 1/8 of a second. I'll set the self timer. Let's see if the self timer runs down and works. It's running down smoothly. And there's our shutter, opens and closes for an 8. That sounded very good. That should be fine. So there's our shutter. Basically that is now ready to be fitted to the front panel of the camera. So here I've got the front panel all cleaned up. There's virtually nothing left in it. And I need to put back the shutter release lever at this stage. So normally I just give that front surface a wipe with molybdenum paste, and you don't need much. And make sure that I get some in those slots where the screws are going to run. And you can see that there's I've left a dirty mark on there and not much more. That's all you need to be doing with molybdenum paste. And this fits into the case. Got to get the shutter release lever here, has to sit correctly in there, like that. That's it. There are 2 fixing screws. The one that the spring fixes to goes in the top position. and the flat headed screw goes here. Check that moves freely up and down. Nip those two screws up tight and check that it still moves freely up and down. And here's their spring, a return spring for that lever. I'll hook that over the posts. Make sure that's nice and free. That's ideal, that's ready to go. So our shutter. This can go back in the case now. Our shutter release arm here, I'm just going to run a wipe of molybdenum paste on there, but that is strictly optional really. That doesn't, not convinced it makes a lot of difference. Get this back into the case. It only goes in one position, and you've got to get your flash sync wire up through that slot. That's probably the hardest thing to sort out. Well, that just fell into place. So much for it being difficult. And check that that's all seated nice and flush. And there are 4 screws that held that in place. Long black screws. And I'll get those tightened up. I should have mentioned that this arm on the shutter release here couples to the back of the shutter. In this case it fell into position, but you may need to give that a wiggle to get it to fall over the shaft at the back of the shutter. That's all my 4 screws in position. I'll just nip them up tight. They need to be tight, but don't overdo it. They're only fairly small screws. You'll distort the heads on them before you strip them, but one way or the other it won't help. Okay, that part's good. Now we need our control gear on the back of the shutter. Well, here are all the parts that need to go onto the back of the shutter, and I've just got to clean all these with naphtha. Now some of them are going to need special attention. This spring piece here, you can see that's got a bit of surface rust on it. I'll need to polish that off. And this bracket here, which holds everything in place, likewise has some surface rust, and I'll need to polish those with brass soap to get those nice and clean. They shouldn't cause me any problems. It's not deep rust, it's nothing like that, but it's on the surface and it means that things won't work smoothly. Not so much in the case of this, but certainly in the case of this. So I'll clean those up off camera with some metal polish. Alright, to start with the reassembly here, there's a shim washer here that goes over that post. Now that's a very thin washer. You may not even notice it because it may be stuck to the back of the shutter there already, and you may not realise there was anything there. Then we have this piece. This piece opens the shutter blades for viewing. So I'm just running some molybdenum paste around that leading edge. We'll pop that in. Then there's a little pinion gear. Now this little pinion gear's got a little stub sticking out the back of it. That couples to that gear, couples to that plate rather. Rotate it till it falls into place. That's it. Then there's a smaller washer, shim washer. And there's this spring that holds all that down in place, and I'm just putting a wipe of molybdenum paste on the end of that where it bears on that washer. That's held down with a single screw. There's another little pinion. This one's got a flattened off, it's a D-shaped hole on this one. Anyway, it's flat side down and the raised boss is upwards here, because that engages in a hole in the bracket that holds it down. So that's all sitting in place. We have our rack, which I'm just going to wipe lightly with molybdenum paste both sides. That sits in here. Now, the pinion at the bottom here, the tooth pointing straight up, should engage with the first notch in the rack there, and the pinion at the top should engage with the fifth notch here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and there. Just check that that's right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's correct. So that's correctly positioned. Now there are two spacer washers. Now inevitably one edge of those is going to have the remains of glue on it, so make sure that that is down towards the bottom, particularly not there where that might rub on there. And we have this plate. Now I'm just going to rub some molybdenum paste on the inside surface of that and around the hole. That fits on there, and there are two screws that hold that in position. I'll do those screws up tight. I'll change this video camera battery while I get the chance. We have this little gear and the bush that goes through the centre of it. So I'll apply some molybdenum paste to the inside of that gear. Now the gear is absolutely flat on one surface, but it's got a raised boss in the centre on the other. The absolute flat surface goes to the back. Let's put our bush in the centre of that first. That goes in there. I have this control arm here. I'd run some molybdenum paste through the screw hole, and on the back face I'm paying particular attention to the underside of this. This is where that end of that rack will run. Just put a little bit of molybdenum paste on there. This has to hook in under that bracket. Line up the screw hole there. and this pivot screw runs through there. It's a shoulder screw. The screw has to pass through the bush in the centre of that gear, and the outside shoulder of the screw at the top is what the arm here pivots on. That's all in place. I'll do that up tight. I've got 2 more pieces to go in here, but nothing exciting. Now I need to test my shutter at this stage before I go any further. I've got a shaft here from an old camera that I use for doing this job. So I'm checking that as I cock that the shutter opens completely. As I release the shutter, the rack ran smoothly back across, and if I push up this little lever here, the rack continued its motion and the shutter fired. So that tells me that everything is correctly in position. In use in the camera, this spring here is under quite a bit of tension. It gets at least a full turn of tension, and that would help to drive everything across there. If I cock that, I'll see if I can tension that spring up. The action will be quite snappy. Yeah, so when that's tensioned up, everything will be good. So what have I got to do here now? Okay, so the first thing is there's a insulating washer that goes on here. That has to be put in place. And there's a buffer that goes on here, the mirror buffer pad. So our insulating washer, let's get that in position. Now that originally would have been glued in position, but you're going to have to put some black paint around here anyway, so you might as well let the paint do the gluing job. What I normally do at this stage is I cock the shutter, which neatly hides my shutter blades, so that when I solder this flash connection I'm in no danger of any spatter of solder or flux hitting those blades. And now all I need to do is go and solder that flash connection and then finish this up.